Bien, si vous voulez bien, nous allons démarrer cette session.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. Thank you for coming so many to this forum. It is really a joy for me to be here.
Cette séance
to facilitate this conference titled War is Not Inevitable, Imagining Peace. The theme of this session, this 38th edition of the Prayer for Peace organized by the community of Sant'Egidio, is fraught with meaning because peace, which at the end of the 20th century and until a few years ago was seen as a common horizon for our now global world, is no longer so and is giving way to movements that are actually going in the opposite direction. In this time, in fact, global challenges that are vital to the survival of humanity, such as global warming, the disappearance of biodiversity, pandemics, whose effects are tangible on the world's population, and they will call for a global mobilization. Well, this mobilization does not take place, and this leads to instability and will lead to future large-scale crises. In geopolitical terms, the international order after World War II is being called into question and is giving way to a chaotic world in which the primacy of the balance of power over respect for the law is asserting itself, thereby undermining the role of UN multilateralism, which, although imperfect, has been the bulwark of the weak against the strong. This third piecemeal world war, which Pope Francis described with acute lucidity in the introduction to his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, published in 2020, is here, before our very eyes. In Europe, with this unprecedented war waged by Russia on Ukraine, and in the recurrence, in its most atrocious form, of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The logics of war are prevailing. The perspective of negotiations seem to be frozen. In addition to these major conflicts with strong international echo, there are many other wars of different intensity and different forms. 59 wars and conflicts listed by the Oslo Peace Research Institute in 2023, the highest number since 1946. There are wars that are not mentioned or about which people don't talk much. For example, the war in Sudan or the war between Ethiopia and Tigray, the Sahel crisis arc, Burma, etc., to name just a few. At the same time, war is becoming something that is slipping into the fields opened up by technology, space, cyber and social networks. So in these horizons, there are thousands of men and women, displaced people, victims, that have the only thing they have known is war, just like their parents that have only known war. So for these people, war is not inevitable. And these wars are playing on people's perceptions in the age of post-truth. So in these shadows of a closed world, to quote Pope Francis once again, where war and violence are now raging free, how can we imagine peace? Peace is at the heart of Sant'Egidio's commitment. It's one of the 3 P's in its logo. Peace is the result of active networks, of active initiatives for the integration of refugees All this is done by the communities in 70 countries. War is not inevitable. Imagining peace is the subject of this forum. And the speakers around the table will address the diversity of their cultures, their religious and non-religious affiliations, their experiences, their commitments, the geographical context in which they are living. All the people around this table are people that have something in common. They are all advocates of peace. So I would like to start by handing the floor over to the Minister of Religious Affairs from Oman, Mohammed Al-Maamari. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Mr. Minister, we're really glad to welcome you here.
السلام عليكم جميعا.
May peace be with you all. First of all, I'm very honored in this international meeting for peace to express to all of you the acknowledgements and thanks of the Sultan from Oman. So he's wishing us all the best so that this conference, this meeting can be successful. I'm also very grateful to the French Republic for organizing this meeting, along with the community of Sant'Egidio, and to everyone who contributed to the organization of this international conference. Ladies and gentlemen, this international meeting for peace takes place at a time where there is no balance left at an international level. There are many changes on the way. Today, we are witnessing an historical time where there's a conflict between the forces that are trying to create divisions, opposed by other forces that are working for unity. This conflict makes us understand that what we are deciding today, what we are choosing today, will have an impact on future generations of today and tomorrow. If we look at the state of play of the international order today, we would see that there are different interpretations of the concept of peace. On the one hand, there's technology and innovations that is pretty advanced that are aiming to bring people closer. And there are international organizations that are trying to consolidate peace. On the other hand, the world and societies are trying to come to terms with new challenges and rising up to them. There are campaigns, cyber campaigns, that are trying to attack the balance and the stability of nations by disseminating or spreading fake news. There's also religious extremism, which is not limited to theoretical concepts, but is actually trying to generate violence and cause divisions. There's interference in national or international affairs. All this has an impact that oversteps the mark and goes beyond every limit, thereby causing a problem and raising a challenge when it comes to the consolidation of the concept of peace. The title of this conference is Imagining Peace. And so we should ask ourselves, what does it mean to imagine peace in a world where the borders that divide the world are not that clear, the boundaries are not that visible? How can we put an end to this vicious circle of wars and conflicts when the causes are not local or regional any longer? We are talking about our international divisions here, and these are ideological divisions, different values. There are people that are turning a blind eye on infringements, severe infringements on human rights and the rights of peoples. To answer this question, we must reimagine peace so that we can have a fully fledged form of peace. So we have to give new momentum to this process and promote it in full, because peace is an ever-changing concept. It is a concept that grows as our world grows, and the needs of our world call for an effort, call for a constant and ongoing work. So we have to reconsider our vision of the world, our vision of humanity, and also our local, international strategies must be reviewed by reiterating the importance of exchanging information, exchanging knowledge and experience. Peace is calling for hard work that starts from our common background, under the banner of constant dialogue, reconciliation, and common human values. The covenant amongst all men and women. Ladies and gentlemen, we can't talk about peace without reinforcing the role played by religious leaders, because they can play a key role in reinforcing the religious language that is responsible for the protection of peace. Peace that goes beyond mere tolerance. Peace that aims to promote deeper values and consolidate our love for a common good. Islam said the true faith does not is not fulfilled if we don't love our neighbor. And this is a very deep religious conflict. So to see the world through somebody else's eyes and recognize our common identity. In Islam, peace, it's not only a time where no conflicts are happening. Peace is a question of stability, of balance in every aspect of our life, deeply linked to common human values, starting from the dignity of human beings. Our holy text says that we have protected the dignity of Adam's offspring. We gave them everything that was good. Well, this dignity can be obtained when we try to find a solution to the causes that are actually triggering conflicts, starting from injustice, persecution, the infringement and violation of human rights. So we have to reinforce the importance of international work and cooperation on all levels to face this injustice, this persecution, to make sure that human rights are respected and become an essential condition for a long-lasting peace. Ladies and gentlemen, in the Sultanate of Oman, we have attached great importance to peace. Peace is the ultimate goal of our state. And to do that, we have adopted an international vision. And we have further reinforced this concept also in the international arena. We have taken stock of our legacy. We have relied on interpersonal ties. We have reinforced the spirit of friendship, understanding, and respect of living together and coexistence with everyone. And this starts from a basic assumption that we're not the only ones in this world. We're not isolated. And every human objective is actually underpinned by cooperation with others, doing good and working for peace. His Holiness, the Sultan of Oman, said that Oman will always be a beacon for human relations based on peace. He said that through history, Oman has always been a country that has worked for prosperity, has worked for peace and security. The message conveyed by Oman for peace has a great legacy to build rather than to destroy, to bring closer rather than to make distances grow. In Oman, we have launched a number of projects to consolidate dialogue between religions and cultures, and to reiterate and consolidate the values of tolerance, understanding, and coexistence, starting from poverty, human rights, conflicts, and wars, bearing in mind that all these factors are intertwined to reach peace once and for all. There's a project of a human alliance that works for common human values. This project was launched back in 2019, and it is based on justice, ethical approaches, by trying to give a model to the world, to help people live in dignity while respecting fundamental human rights. There are three essential dimensions to restore the balance in today's world. First of all, we try to improve the lives of human beings by reinforcing dignity, human rights, and maintaining cohesion. And secondly, we try to adopt an ethical system that is global, whereby people can make a common effort to protect men and women and our planet, and finally have peace, understanding, and coexistence, bearing in mind that ideological, cultural, religious differences are not an obstacle before faith and our common values. And thirdly, reinforcing the spiritual values of human beings, starting from philosophy, reason. There are three key points here that make reference to human beings and their attitude to reinforce culture, respect for life, understanding, working to reinforce the values of cooperation, social cooperation, and social values. There are no religious differences. There are no differences in terms of culture, in terms of identity. We focus on human beings, or what is common between them, on common human values. We don't try to get rid of these differences, but we try to protect these differences as well by making the most of them. And we try to work to promote common interests and to work to promote common values. And then there's the message for peace, launched back in 2011, to face the language of hatred, the narrative of hatred and stereotypes by reinforcing the constructive dialogue between different religions and denominations in the world. Looking at the experience in Oman of mutual understanding and peaceful coexistence, this project was warmly welcomed at a global level. 140 international events were organized within the framework of this project, with the ultimate goal of consolidating the alliance between all the people involved. So the constructive involvement, the constructive cooperation is possible regardless of differences, also in the light of the challenges that lie ahead. Ladies and gentlemen, it is high time that we live peace. Peace must not be a dream, a distant dream any longer. We must all know that to reach this reality, we need to take steps forward. We need to overcome differences. Let's dream together. Let's cherish this dream together. Let's have a renewed commitment for this noble ambition. And this is what we want to do after this meeting. When we leave here, we want to write a new history for this world, a history where peace is not an exception, but rather a fundamental base that new generations should look at. We need to write a new history for an enlightened future, a future that is more peaceful and safer. Finally, I would like to thank everyone who worked to organize this meeting for peace. I would like to thank once again the community of Sant'Egidio for the work they have carried out and all the efforts that they have put in the peace-building process with the hope of establishing sound relationships and healthy relationships with all the participants in this conference here in Paris. Thank you very much.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Minister, for having opened this session with such a broad vision. I also wish to mention, as you yourself were rightly saying, that if we want to be actors for peace, we have to begin by focusing on coexistence at home, which is what you are doing in your country, above and beyond our ideological differences, above and beyond the divides between people. We have to always remember that we are all human beings. That is the very core of our lives. I'd now like to give the floor to Cardinal Fridolin Ambongo Besungu, who is Archbishop of Kinshasa. And since 2018, he has also been the Vice President of the Bishops' Conference of the Congo. He was elected Cardinal in 2019. Your Eminence, over to you.
Bonjour à tout le monde.
Good afternoon, everybody. War isn't inevitable, as our title says. Imagining peace. Dear brothers and sisters, as we know and as we see almost every day, we currently live in an era of wars. Wars and peaces. Global wars which are spread out throughout the world. An overview would show that around the world there are roughly 30 wars or conflict zones in the world. Yesterday, President Macron said that there are some 50 wars currently happening worldwide, which means that there are 50 places in the world in which war is being waged, and 1/3 of those areas are in Africa. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, my country, we are experiencing a terrible conflict which has now lasted for 30 years, especially in the eastern part of the country. This broad conflict involves a number of different armed groups, and it also affects a number of states. It affects a number of regional and international players as well, which is why the war in the Congo has been described as being, quote, African world wars, unquote. But it's not just African countries which are involved in this conflict taking place in the DRC, and I'll explain why. In fact, this war is a forgotten war. It is often ignored. It is often overlooked in the press and by the international media. The conflict in Congo is often perceived as being a crisis which is secondary compared to other crises which are considered as being high-intensity wars. But we too have our share of deaths. However, the point isn't that of ranking conflicts from the most to the least important, or between those which are more or less intense. It's a matter of understanding that there is a common thread between all of these conflicts. Wherever they may be, and however intense they may be, they always share something. There's always a common thread between these conflicts. The wars in the eastern part of the DRC over the years have caused over 6 million deaths in 30 years and almost 4 million internally displaced people. This is the highest number in the world of people who were forced to abandon their homes within their countries. In the east, around Goma and in the Ituri region, this is a true humanitarian scandal. And above and beyond this merely numerical aspect, the most painful aspect refers to the length, the duration, and the entity of the war itself. Obviously, after 3 decades, we have seen generations of children growing up without a single day of peace. What this means is that war is a part of their life. It is a part of the landscape in the eastern part of my country. And people have almost grown accustomed to living in war. War has become part of their daily lives. But why don't we try to change the storytelling? This obscure description can also allow us to develop a different storytelling compared to the one which summarizes this war. There's another approach that I think can shed some light on the truth. And in the spirit of truth, and in the narration of conflicts, Pope Francis, during his visit to the DRC in Kinshasa, decided to listen to the direct testimonies of the victims of the war, to the victims of atrocities. Pope Francis decided to listen to and to experience firsthand what the men and women experience in that war-torn region. And that unique experience revealed what war truly is. War back home means murders, rapes, slavery, corruption, and so on. And after meeting these witnesses, the Holy Father delivered one of his most outspoken remarks on the conflict in the DRC, and I quote, "These conflicts force millions of people to abandon their homes, leading to very serious violations of human rights. They disintegrate our social and economic fabric, leading to wounds which are difficult to heal. These are partisan struggles which are intertwined with ethnic, territorial, and group dynamics. They are conflicts which have to do with land ownership, with a lack of or weakness of institutions. Hate, infiltrated by the blasphemy of violence in the name of a false god. But, above all, it is a war which is fed by a greed for raw materials and money, which in turn nurtures an armed economy which requires instability and corruption. What a scandal, and how hypocritical this is. People are raped and killed, while the corporations that cause violence and death continue to prosper." End of quote by the Holy Father. Now, the truth of the conflict in the Congo, in all of its complexity, is clearly expressed by these words by Pope Francis in his remarks. There are economic reasons behind a number of conflicts which are described as being merely ethnic or tribal or border conflicts. But the truth is that this is an economic war. Of course, words, language are often manipulated so that the minds and feelings of people can be pushed towards hate and conflict. However, we should not forget that for many years now, in the east part of the DRC, a true war economy has developed. A war economy which benefits a very limited number of warlords and which exists to the detriment of most of the local population, which goes to show that war has also become a business. And the militias, in fact, are paying salaries to an entire generation of unemployed youths, including children. And in fact, it isn't by chance that the elementary schools in the northern province of Kivu have now become military targets. They want to force children to refrain from imagining a future other than war, because that's where they recruit children to turn them into children soldiers. And let me take this opportunity to thank the community of Sant'Egidio for their commitment in supporting the children and the other people living in Goma's refugee camps and in other refugee camps throughout the country. Therefore, within this context, the country has to pay major economic costs. But we also have to mention the human costs that are an obstacle to the development of Congo's entire society. This new narrative has to be explained because we tend to forget the human cost. Violence acts as if it were a virus within society, which swiftly infects it. For example, by using social networks, no one can say, well, I didn't know what was happening in the eastern part of Congo. Everybody knows, but we pretend we don't. And the images we see, especially on young people's smartphones, illustrate a cruel and absurd violence. They show how violence can be imitated and reproduced. And the young people who see this violence, the young people who see these images, end up imitating this violence. They copy it. And when facing this phenomenon, I think that nobody can feel safe anymore. We are all truly involved. That's why, in such a context, our duty is to dare to imagine peace. But how can that be done in such a context? And I think that despite this truly sad context, I think that to us, imagining peace is a need we have. It is a serious moral duty we all have. But how? How can we achieve that? Well, allow me to go back to what Pope Francis said in Kinshasa when he referred to the situation. And I quote, "The Holy Father said, 'May you yourselves become trees of life. May you become as trees, which absorb pollution and give back oxygen.' Or as the African proverb says, 'In life, be like the palm tree, the palm date, which receives stones and gives back dates.' This is the Christian prophecy, to respond to evil with good, to hate with love, to division with reconciliation. This means that the solution to this problem is, in fact, in each of our hands. Through our choices, we all have the possibility of changing that which appears to be inevitable, like war, that which seems unavoidable, such as the need to take revenge. Whereas it is possible to change that which appears to be inevitable in peace. To do this, we need to give a voice to the victims. We have to listen to them. Otherwise, we would only listen to one version of reality, and it wouldn't allow us to see reality as a whole. It isn't all right to listen to only one side of the conflict, because we may end up ignoring the victims, and we must listen to them. Secondly, we cannot think that unilateral solutions can be found, because peace, long-lasting peace, can only be built together through dialogue, by talking to one another, by having a dialogue. That's when peace becomes possible. That's when peace is always possible. Thirdly, we have to learn to change the way we depict the events, the dramatic events we witness. We have to change the narrative. It's all right And we have to give priority to the reasons of peace compared to the reasons which amplify and perpetuate violence and which push people towards violence and revenge. And this meeting organized by the community of Sant'Egidio can be a real kairos for us, allowing us to imagine peace in the world and in my country. Thank you. Thank you, Eminence. Thank you for having given us this very broad overview of the war. A war which has been affecting your country for so long. Thank you for mentioning that it is an economic war, because Congo's damnation lies in its underground wealth, which leads to war, which so many of us have become accustomed to. Thank you for saying that we have to change the narrative regarding war by listening to victims and by making sure that we all take responsibility for our actions. And religions have to work from this point of view. Thank you for sharing this very moving words with us. And I'd like to give the floor to Donia Kaouach, Director General of the Leaders pour la Paix Foundation in France, a foundation launched by former Prime Minister Jean-Pierre Courage. Over to you. Good morning, and with your permission, I will remain seated. I think there's no better place to be seated between Africa and Jerusalem if we want to imagine peace.
Alors, je voudrais commencer par...
I'd like to begin with an observation, which I think represents the paradox of the world we live in. Our humanity has never had so many tools to reach peace. And as Élisabeth was saying rightfully, unfortunately, we have never had a situation with so many conflicts. Which means that, yes, we have made progress, but we have lost our humanity, or part of our humanity. That's the first thing which led our foundation to creating the project that I will be describing later, a project which we feel is the best way to imagine peace, which is reinvesting in all things human. But I'll come back to this later. Imagination is important because, as Paul Ricoeur said, imagination allows us to counter inevitability. It allows us to overcome our fossilized thoughts with which the New World Order was organized after World War II. Therefore, what can we do to avoid falling into the same old traps? What have we done wrong since we have so many tools given to us by science, allowing us to have peace and human and climate security? What have we done wrong? We live in a world in which we still talk about using nuclear weapons, a world in which we have so many weapons. In fact, we have more weapons than ever. Now we know that the Pax Romana no longer works. In many conflicts in Ukraine and in the Middle East, we are witnessing a new situation in terms of international relations. Because even when military forces, even when the military balance is in favor of one side, this is no longer enough to win a war. The ability to resist, the ability modern societies currently have to be resilient has to be taken into account. And therefore, as Bertrand Badi says, we are in front of the powerlessness of power. The old powers, which in the past used to define the international political order, can no longer do so. That is the first thing I wanted to mention. Secondly, the second idea I'd like to share today is that there is an obvious link, a very strong link, between conflict and the governance deficit. We used to refer to the situation in Congo, Kinshasa, Your Eminence, a country that we have worked in for a long time. We have been to Goma. We have seen hell on earth in Goma. But what is it that keeps Africa stuck in its conflicts? Isn't it the governance deficit? Isn't it the political leaders' inability to build a future or a possible future outlook? I'm saying this because as a Tunisian, I experienced the Arab Spring, and I saw the arrival of a extremist religion regime followed by a populist regime. And I said, how is it possible that after Bourguiba, after the emancipation, after the new constitution, we have taken so many steps back? Because the biggest evil in these political systems, the biggest pain that they inflict upon their populations isn't the lack of freedom of the press. The biggest evil they impose on their people is the fact that they destroy public life. With the collapse of a system, the population is no longer capable of offering an alternative. And what we ourselves experience will continue happening in many parts of the continent, a continent in which over 60% of armed conflicts is currently happening, in which we are witnessing an obvious demographic boom, which will have to be governed. A continent, Africa, which will have the highest number of victims due to the climate and energy crises. It is a continent which has so many resources and so many talents, and yet it hasn't created what I refer to as the trade union of the future, the trade union of those who will have to build the future, those who will have to improve the situation in terms of governance. And we aren't capable of giving our populations the answers they require. So why is it that so many people leave their countries? No one wants to leave their home joyfully. Nobody wants to be uprooted. But they leave their countries because they don't have good governance. They don't have good political leaders. So what should we do? We have to imagine human peace and rehumanize geopolitics. Because as the minister was saying earlier, violence is always rooted in the dehumanization of others. Look at what's happening in the Middle East, in Gaza. There is a sort of macabre accounting, which means that deaths have now merely become numbers. This is a serious dehumanization. And everywhere throughout the world, we're seeing this generalized indifference in which victims are numbers, whereas the human being has to be at the very center of all of our policies, which is what we decided to do with our association. We want to invest in human beings. We want to bring back academic excellence where it no longer exists, so we can create a third path between the status quo and violence, between dictatorships incapable of offering political alternatives and the responses which are often controlled by extremist groups. So we decided to begin by starting what we refer to as itinerant schools for peace. These are schools that we organize in countries at risk, where we want to train young political leaders. We train them academically to allow them to govern the world, which changes so quickly, allowing them to understand disinformation, artificial intelligence. We offer culture, knowledge, allowing them to understand international relations. And we decided to increase the scale of the project. Initially, the project envisages a few days in the various regions, which isn't enough, of course. We can't merely stay in a country for 10 days if we want to bring about change. So we decided to build a university in Africa, which will bring together a number of African countries, the goal of which is to educate their elites, which often already exist. We want to give them an outlook as far as the future is concerned. And we also want to set up partnerships with international universities, because this is a three-dimensional project. What I mean by that is that it is local, because it is located in the country. It is also regional, because we want to train a number of students in regions. But we also want to have a global dimension. We want to project Africa in the world and integrate Africa within the world. And this project is also a window we wish to open on the world so that these young people can have a dialogue and become peace leaders. This is the project we have embarked upon. This is a very operational and concrete project, one of the few which we feel can give a strong response to this eruption of violence we're witnessing everywhere. And within this university, we want to work on rehumanizing international relations. We want to remind all those who will build the future of our world that behind any political decision, perhaps invading another country, behind these decisions, you always have men and women. And therefore, we have to understand that human beings have to be our priority whenever a political decision is made. Thank you.
Merci, chère Donia, pour ce brief.
Thank you very much, Donia, for this beautiful contribution, also for reminding us of the importance of talking about important principles, but also concrete projects. And thank you also for reminding us of what His Eminence said earlier, that is to say, the ability of societies to resist, the fact that we must also rely on societies without forgetting, of course, victims. We have to listen to the victims, but also rely on the potential of civil societies, as well as the importance of giving new momentum to public life, which, of course, by revitalizing it, requires also a reinterpretation of what governance is in all over the world. So it is important to set aside the dehumanization that we see everywhere. Pope Francis talks about a globalization of indifference, and it is precisely this. Thank you truly for reminding us of all this. I think that you have kindled the curiosity of the attendants towards your project. So that is aimed at creating leaders, but also making people become aware of the fact that intelligence and knowledge must be put at the service of a common good. I will now hand the floor to His Eminence Husein Kavazović, Grand Mufti of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Since 2012, Bosnia, the Balkans, have suffered a lot due to a long and terrible war, and there's still tension going on. Eminence, the floor is yours.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim.
In the name of Allah the Merciful, dear friends, dear members of the community of Sant'Egidio, eminences, excellencies, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, the greeting of Moses, upon him peace, was in Hebrew Shalom Ekalam, and it was also the greeting of Jesus. Upon him be peace, in Aramaic Salam Alun. Mohammed's greeting, upon him peace, was As-salam alaikum, peace be upon you. On one occasion, the seal of the prophets of Allah, Mohammed, said, there are no people who mention Allah, the Almighty, unless they are surrounded by angels and covered with mercy, and upon whom tranquility descends, and Allah mentions them in His presence. The world in which we live is in dire need of remembering Allah, the merciful and the compassionate. The terrible suffering of innocent people in Gaza, in Israel, in Ukraine, in Sudan, in other arenas of murders and destruction are evidence that we have forgotten God. We have forgotten His teachings. We have forgotten His warnings. So I ask the Almighty God to support us in this meeting with His guidance and His blessing. And I ask Him to give us strength so that humanity can find the home of peace. In difficult times, people of faith must not be paralyzed or closed in themselves, but they have to be witnesses of truth in the name of God. They have to be witnesses of justice. People of faith are called believers because they do not lose hope, because they trust in God, and because they are certain that good will eventually win over evil in ourselves and around us. This is why I would like to express my thanks to the organizers of this meeting and to all of you who, through your faith, are eager to seek a glimmer of hope that will free us from the wars, hatred, and discrimination to which we are driven by truly irresponsible leaders. I also take this opportunity to acknowledge and thank my friend, Professor Menahem Rosensaft, for the courage and determination with which he joined me after the appalling escalation of violence in and around Gaza with a document we called the Principles of the Kavazović-Rosensaft Dialogue. This document illustrates the tools needed to preserve interfaith communication and maintain a communication open in difficult times of global, regional, and local conflicts. Global, regional, and local conflicts involving the Muslim and Jewish communities and all those who join us in this path. The Muslim-Jewish Initiative for Peace and the Preservation of Memory was signed this year at the Protokari Memorial Center in Srebrenica, where we preserve the memory of the victims of the Srebrenica genocide as part of the commemoration program of the International Day of Remembrance, which falls on the 27th of January. The signing of this document was attended by representatives of the Mothers of Srebrenica and the Jewish community in Bosnia and Herzegovina, led by a friend, Jacob Finci, as well as several diplomats and local officials. This document is a symbolic contribution to the efforts to put an end to the suffering of innocent people in the Holy Land, and to find in our common past and in our faith the ability to overcome this difficult period in our relations and to remain steadfast in the principles and teachings of our religions. In this document, which everyone can accept and take as a starting point, we affirmed our commitment to never forget and to commemorate the victims of previous genocides. And we pledged to always remember and commemorate the victims of the Holocaust and the genocide in Srebrenica. We pledged to constantly remember them so that future generations will also remember that these victims were once alive and they were brutally murdered. And this way, we are undertaking to do everything in our power to counter hatred, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, xenophobia, racism, and other forms of intolerance that made it possible the genocides in Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Srebrenica, Jasenovac, and other places to happen. Other places that witness such atrocities. We have pledged our societies to reject, condemn, and publicly expose all manifestations of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, xenophobia, and other forms of intolerance, as well as all forms of racial, ethnic, religious, and national hatred. We have declared that we will never stay silent when faced with the killing, torture, rape, hostage-taking, and murder of men, women, and children because of their racial, ethnic, religious, or national identity. We're also committed to rejecting and condemning any glorification of the perpetrators of these crimes or attempts at rehabilitation. We want to protect the lives of civilians. Our active cooperation will include support, external support and intervention when necessary, with the primary goal of protecting the innocent and the vulnerable during conflicts, including current and future ones. We emphasize that we support the right of the leaders of our societies to freely express their concerns and opinions, provided they do so in a climate of mutual respect and tolerance. This open expression is the basis for promoting understanding and will not hinder our ongoing dialogue. Rather, it will enrich it and create a basis of mutual trust and respect. We also are pledged to keep stable and supportive channels of communication, recognizing that sympathy and mutual respect are the key to managing and building lasting peace. Finally, we made a commitment that in times of crisis we will stand together, joining our forces and resources, knowledge and strategies, so that our joint efforts will be aimed at crisis management, peacekeeping and reconstruction, ensuring the strong support and protection of our communities. Today, as the evils of xenophobia, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia spread throughout Europe and the world, we must reiterate our commitment to be good neighbors, looking out for each other's interests, as we have done in the past. The Bosnian experience and the Srebrenica initiative can be an inspiration and a guide for all of us. In this sense, I am often reminded of the words of the great Bosnian poet Muzmachasim Katic, who said, "We will survive because our principles are different and our feelings are deeper and warmer. Because we're not afraid of the other, neither of the different nor of the better, because we warm ourselves with ourselves." In conclusion, I ask Allah, the one and only, not to be among those who have forgotten Allah and been forgotten by Him, and to be among those who hope for His promise in the Holy Quran, to the prayerful often and to the prayerful for all God has prepared forgiveness and immense merit. God bless you all, and thank you very much.
Merci, Éminence, pour ces paroles fortes.
Thank you very much, Your Eminence, for these strong words, especially because they come from a religious leader of a country that was a martyr of war caused by ethnic religious reasons. So this joint initiative that involved Jews and Muslims is even more important considering the context in which it is happening. Now, I will hand the floor over to another witness of a region that is undergoing a crisis, Father Ibrahim Faltas, Custodial Vicar of the Holy Land. Thank you.
Buonasera a tutti. Pace e bene a tutti.
Good evening, you all. Peace be upon you. This is my Franciscan welcome, and I would like to thank the community of Sant'Egidio for the invitation to share my witness of the Holy Land. Today we are facing a theme that is very dear to our hearts: war and peace. We often consider war as an inevitable destiny, a cycle of violence and suffering. But I would like to urge you to think of peace as an active process that promotes dignity, justice, and solidarity. In the present time, it is difficult to think of peace. We are surrounded by conflicts in Lebanon, Gaza, Israel, Ukraine, Sudan, Syria, as you all said. And in many other countries, there are 59 conflicts underway, so Third World War. However, we must have the courage to take a step forward by working together for the common good. Imagining peace means to join forces, to build bridges, rather than walls. This is possible. I would like to express my gratitude to the community of Sant'Egidio and to the Italian government for rescuing 200 people, mainly children, from Gaza by offering them medical assistance. These children, despite the trauma of war, have rediscovered the will to smile and to look at a brighter future. This is a concrete example of how a common commitment can build a bridge of peace. Thank you very much, community of Sant'Egidio, for showing us all that there is a concrete model, yours, of your commitment and your will to build a bridge for peace and save many human lives. These children were dead, were almost dead, and they were brought back to life. They were under the rubble. They were under the rubble, and now they are doing great in Italy. I would also like to share with you a story of peace that began more than 800 years ago. The meeting between Francis of Assisi and the Sultan of Egypt, Malik al-Kamil. The Gospel and the Quran met. Francis, open and bold, overcame the ideological barriers of his time, embracing the religious sensitivity of the Sultan. This meeting is still very topical and invites us to go down a path of reconciliation. Today, we remember the document of Human Brotherhood for Global Peace, signed on the 4th of February 2019 in Abu Dhabi by Pope Francis and by the great Imam Ahmad al-Tayyib. We witness an historical moment that invites us to rediscover ourselves as brothers and sisters and to promote justice and peace by protecting human rights and religious freedom.
La nostra storia francescana.
Our Franciscan history. I'm a Franciscan friar. I'm Egyptian. I'm a custodial vicar of the Holy Land. I've lived in Jerusalem for more than 35 years now. I've experienced first-hand the tensions of this war, from Intifada to the siege of the Basilica of Nativity, until the conflict that broke out once again on the 7th of October 2023. The lack of dialogue between Israel and Palestine has fueled tensions, leading to a long and unexpected war. Our mission as Franciscans is to be custodians of the holy places, to promote the life of the Christian community. We undertake to make sure that families have a safe roof on their heads. They are guaranteed dignity through access to work and education. We help the sick. We work for the well-being of community, acting as a bridge of dialogue and sharing. We have been a holy land for, we have been in the Holy Land for 800 years. 2,000 friars were killed, also to cherish the people of the Holy Land and protect them. Let's start again from war for a future of peace. Working for peace in a time of war is a challenge, especially in a context of growing violence between Israel, Gaza, West Bank, and Lebanon. Suffering is universal, and many Christians abandon Bethlehem and Jerusalem because they are worried for the future of their children. Our joy in celebrating in the holy places is watered down by the absence of local believers. They've always animated our communities, and also the absence of pilgrims. The main emergency in Gaza is survival. Famine, hunger, and thirst are killing every day. Nature is devastated. Air and water are polluted by the bombings, whereas tons of rubble, debris, and waste accumulate, spreading many diseases. Deaths, unfortunately, grow daily. If people don't die under the bombings, they die because there are no medicines, there are no drugs, there are no hospitals where to go. Many of them have been destroyed. They die of hunger, they die of thirst, they die of heat, they die of cold, they die of anything. The cruelty of war is facing us with the hate of life, pushing human beings, people with the story and the dignity, to flee the rubble of their homes. Those people are crowded in places that should be safe, but it actually end up being deadly traps. I cannot forget the eyes of those who see denied their existential rights and suffer violence and abuse. Those looks are looks of terror. They tell a story of pain, death, devastation, exposing silence and indifference. We are witnesses of an evil that seems to be endless, and they're calling for an awakening of the conscience of those who unfortunately do nothing to stop this violence. Pope Francis has more than once called for a ceasefire and to put an end to this war, but his words were left unheard. It is fundamental for all of us to join him in this appeal to promote every form of peace and dialogue. beyond Gaza. The war in Gaza has repercussions also on the West Bank and in Bethlehem, where today the fear and poverty are a tangible reality. The situation is sadder every day. I get requests for help from men and women who ask to be given the possibility to work and to support their families in a context of urgent needs, further exacerbated by a conflict that has reduced the flow of pilgrims to the holy places. These people are asking at least for the permission to cross the checkpoint towards Israel, to look for job opportunities, to regain dignity and hope. It is the same wall that separates their lives from a better future. A wall that before the 7th of October represented a barrier, but that now marks the boundary between despair and hope. The death of thousands of innocent children is a defeat for mankind, and it is undermining human dignity. These children have been stripped of their childhood, and they are bearing the weight of an uncertain and painful future. Many children are disabled, and they will be for all their lives. Many are orphans. 20,000 children who are now orphans. Many children are refugees, forced to leave their homes, their memories, their toys, their family pictures, and to live in refugee camps with no safe place, no education. Every child has the right to live in peace, to grow in a healthy environment, and to have access to the opportunities they need to fulfill their potential. It is our task to make sure that this right is respected, so that every child can keep dreaming, playing, and having a better future. Children are the future of mankind, and they deserve to live in a safe, healthy, and protected environment. The right to life is one of the fundamental rights recognized by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, adopted by the UN in 1989. This right is not only a mere statement, rather a principle that must be respected and protected in every corner of the planet. This war destroyed every human principle. Beyond death and devastation of an entire country, we have to come to terms with the terrible condition of the hostages that has caused immense suffering to the Israeli families and has caused rift in the public opinion, both Israeli and international. Shared suffering. Israel is suffering. Gaza is suffering. All of us are suffering. All of us who live in the Holy Land, a plot of land torn by war. Israeli mothers are crying for their children who are gone, whereas the civilians in Gaza are taken hostage by conflict that they haven't chosen. These people travel from north to south in the strip looking for shelter. We feel like hostages ourselves, even if we are apparently free. War and the decisions of the powerful are actually blocking us, preventing us from making plans and to live safely. We are trapped in a spiral of revenge and hatred. How much help we should ask God to find back our dignity, justice, and forgiveness. a future of peace. Imagining a future of peace is not only a dream, but an act of will and creativity. We must act to make sure that peace is not left as an abstract concept. We have to experience peace every day, especially in our community and in our schools. I firmly believe that one of the most effective ways to achieve peace is through education. Teaching new generations about tolerance, respect, understanding those who are different, to create a culture of peace. Curricula in schools, including history in different cultures and interreligious dialogue, can contribute to form a generation that is committed towards social justice. I just would like to bring an example that can be a new starting point in a time of war. In our Franciscan schools, we have further enriched our curricula, bearing in mind that children are living in an era of conflicts. Our students are Muslims and Christians. We also have visually and hearing impaired children. Also, Jews are attending our School of Music of the Magnificat. For this reason, we have added courses in Hebrew. We are offering courses on other religions. Even if we live in a religious microcosm characterized by the three big monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, we have acknowledged the presence of a significant cultural and religious gap. Small steps, small actions, albeit constant, day after day, are helping our students to build important and sound pillars for a new society. The society, even if born and grown in a time of war and fear, has a vision of hope and offers concrete opportunities to build a future of peace and coexistence between peoples. To conclude, even if we don't see any glimpse of hope, we have to stand up together and to keep walking along the path of dialogue. It is the only way that could lead us towards peace. We are offspring of this time, but above all, we are children of God. For the love of life, for the love of the life that was given us, united in prayer, we can do a lot, standing by the side of the weakest by promoting actions and signs of peace. We cannot afford to stay under the rubble of this war. Saint Francis has taught us that today is the time to realize what to the eyes of the world might seem impossible. We can make it possible, because in our hearts a new hope is born every day, a new dream of peace. So let's be custodians of the stream of peace. We are the only ones who can make it come true. Today we are here, coming from different countries, many different countries. We are standing as one people. We are joining Pope Francis in his appeal. Let's listen to the voice of the peoples that are calling for peace. Let's listen to the voice of the peoples that are calling for peace. Let's listen to the voice of the peoples that are calling for peace. Amen.
Merci, mon père.
Thank you, Father. Thank you for sharing a view on the war that you are witness to. Thank you for reminding us of the fact that we should never lose hope and that we should always continue to struggle and to work towards a better future, our future, the future of the region. For reminding us that we must continue working for children. The floor now goes to Nelson Moda, who is a member of the community of Sant'Egidio in Mozambique. The community of Sant'Egidio has a very long history in Mozambique. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing this story with us. And I'd like to ask you to please be brief because we do have some time constraints. Over to you, sir.
Grazie per la parola.
Thank you for giving me the floor. Imagining peace and setting up a dialogue to promote understanding and to avoid conflicts. That is one of the pillars of the primitive intelligence of our population, in which the younger generations coexisted with the older ones in mutual respect and in a necessary submission. Dear brothers and sisters, during my presentation, allow me to share the reminiscence of the civil war in Mozambique, which began shortly after the country's independence in 1975. The country has recently emerged from the armed struggle to liberate the country from the Portuguese colonizers. This was a civil struggle linked by the nationalist movement in 1975. The country has recently emerged from the armed struggle of independence to liberate the country from the Portuguese colonizers. This was a struggle linked by the nationalist movement called Frelimo, the Mozambique Liberation Front, which led to the proclamation of independence. And 1 year after the proclamation of independence, I won't talk about our independence, but of the events which happened after independence, namely the civil war in Mozambique, which began 1 year after the proclamation of independence in 1976, a conflict which ended in 1992. We had 16 years of war, and we ourselves as Mozambicans should have avoided that. After having become independent, we quickly lost our sense of family, our sense of sharing, by focusing on personal and group interests. Frelimo, the movement for the liberation from colonialism, which was the outcome of the union of smaller movements who wanted to free themselves from occupation in a different way, with a regional approach under the guidance of Marshal Samora Moises Machel, became a political party, a Marxist and Leninist political party, wishing to guide the destiny of a country which at the time only had 14 million inhabitants. 1 year after independence, there was a wave of domestic malaise against our governance model. And in late 1976, RENAMO was created, the National Mozambique Resistance, led by the then young André Matade Matsangisa, who died in combat in 1979, and who was replaced by another young man, Afonso Jacama. This was an internal guerrilla, which also received major external support, especially from southern Rhodesia, currently Zimbabwe. With the initial attacks immediately after independence, many believed that these were sporadic attacks, short attacks that could easily be stopped. Distinguished members of the audience, a civil war isn't something which was programmed. It was the outcome of simple protests which began with offensive language being hurled from one to the other, with verbal attacks to impose one's will on the other. War began with language, therefore, not with weapons. And to end the war, Professor Riccardi, the founder of the community of Sant'Egidio, who was one of the community's mediators to work for peace in Mozambique, Professor Riccardi began with language. And Andrea Riccardi often remembers when he talks to us and with the entire Mozambican generation, that in the very first days during the peace talks, the main challenge was to convince the parties involved to recognize themselves as being members of the same family, the Mozambican family, and to change the language they would typically use. Because language is what starts wars. In fact, at the time, the government would refer to the Renamo guerrilla members as armed bandits, and the members of the guerrilla would refer to the members of the government as communists. And during the peace talks in Rome, the first step was that of learning the alphabet of fraternity and of a language of respect for one another. That's how we started to imagine peace around that table. And there could be no peace dialogue without first recognizing the men and women involved as being part of the same family. And following the painful experience of civil war in Mozambique, we can now share a number of teachings which allow us to say that that war was useless. In fact, war is always useless, and that's why it must always be avoided. For years, we experienced a sad existence, with children being kidnapped and turned into soldiers to fight against their very parents, to destroy their own cities and villages. We think of the women, the mothers, who were forced to witness the killing of their children in the most cruel ways possible. And even now, after 30 years of peace, we have never forgotten the families divided by war, the families which were forced to fight one another in a daily routine of pain and bloodshed, in which almost nobody could imagine the possibility of peace, although everybody wanted peace. It was everyone against everyone else. Neither the government or Renamo knew how long the war would last. At a certain point, everyone was tired. Everybody wanted peace. And yet everybody continued to wage war, causing death and suffering to people. Those who wage war, as Mario Giro wrote, is like those who use drugs. They enter the cycle without understanding that they could end up being addicts, suffering and even dying. Much like those who use drugs, those who wage war want to come out of it, although they don't know how. Therefore, they continue fighting as if they couldn't do without it. And we in Mozambique, after so much war and so many deaths, had almost grown used to war. We conformed, and we had made peace something unimaginable. There were some internal and external initiatives to try to convince the parties at war to choose peace, although it seemed as if war was spreading increasingly. Dear brothers and sisters, when wars are intense, as the war in Congo, as His Eminence was saying, when war is intense and long, the path towards peace seems powerless and insignificant. In Mozambique, ending war and bringing peace back only became possible thanks to solidarity with victims. And humanitarian aid from Europe started coming into Mozambique during the war. With war, Mozambique had become the world's poorest country. We hadn't been able to avoid war and to imagine peace. And by doing so, it's almost as if we had to accept hunger and misery of all types, as if they were the legitimate offspring of war. The country had no food because people no longer produced anything, and we depended entirely on external aid. Whole families were dying because they were eating unhealthy tubers. We would die of hunger, of thirst, of illnesses and diseases, including the warring factions. An intense war doesn't choose its victims, and yet it has consequences for everybody. Everybody loses due to war. Humanity and humanism lose due to war. Religions, all of us who are present here, with our different traits, can reactivate our spirit of dialogue. We can become the cornerstones upon which we can build a world of peace. As religions, as societies, and as a political class, we are all fragile if we are isolated. But by imagining peace together, we can become strong and brave in building a better world. Mozambique reached peace not because it was strong, but because in its weakness, due to war, it met and listened to someone who did imagine peace. And here, I wish to mention and once again thank the community of Sant'Egidio for showing so much interest and for committing to achieving peace in Mozambique. Thanks to the community of Sant'Egidio, thousands of Mozambicans rose up from the ashes of death. And that interest began in 1984, exactly 40 years ago. After over 30 years of peace in Mozambique, why is it that Sant'Egidio continues to be present in our country? Well, because peace isn't merely an accord. Peace means constant building. We have to build peace by offering tangible help to the poor, to children, to the elderly, to the sick, to all those in need. We have to help the country build a strong civil society. That's why, in all of Mozambique's regions, after 30 years, so many local communities have sprung up, made up of young adults, of men and women, who help to rebuild the country free of charge and to help the poorest especially. That is our commitment. And as you can see from our experience, we began by showing solidarity to the victims of war. And then our gaze broadened towards a greater need, which was how to achieve peace through dialogue. The audacity to work for peace becomes stronger when we see the wounds of the victims. That's when our humanism can be reborn, a humanism which doesn't want to conform to the suffering of others. And therefore, peace can be imagined if we blend solidarity with diplomacy, diplomacy based on an open, sincere, and uninterested dialogue. In 1992, on the 4th of October, when we finally received news that the General Peace Accord had been signed in Rome from the community of Sant'Egidio, celebrations were even greater than the ones we had for our national independence. In the struggle for independence in the regional, continental, and global context, there was the belief that we could reach victory, more so than during the Civil War. During colonialism, the struggle was aimed at achieving independence, whereas during the Civil War, the effort was that of recognizing one another as parts of the same family, destined to coexist with our political, cultural, and ethnic diversity. And I'll conclude by stating that we live in a world marked by constant wars. But peace can still be imagined and achieved, because it is unacceptable for children, women, men, youth and adults in the north and south of the world, in the world's outskirts and in its center, all made to resemble God. None of us have to suffer and die for the greed of a minority which wants to establish itself as a power. Let's talk, let's have a dialogue, let's confront one another. Our primitive intelligence, the intelligence of dialogue, which is the highest possible way of imagining peace, has become the one we less believe in, although it is the most effective. And yet it is the only weapon, with which we can fight peacefully to obtain peace. We have no wheel to invent to achieve peace. We already know what to do, and we know that it is effective. We can use dialogue. A dialogue where there is war, and dialogue where there is no war as a way of avoiding war. And if we want to avoid war, we have to urgently re-establish a common language. The art of dialogue, the art of understanding, of accepting those who are different from me. The art of respect and of coexistence with those who are different. These have to be essential pillars if we want to have a future marked by global peace. Because no nation, no people can be truly fulfilled and joyful as long as we continue to consider others as enemies. War can be avoided if we find a balance in the language we use. Our language is far too incendiary, offensive. Our language provokes. The world isn't a video game. People, others, are just like us. They are filled with feelings, with emotions, frustration and joy. Our choices are the outcome of our feelings and our emotions. Our leaders, be they political or religious, should cherish an embracing language, one that can leave space to the encounter and dialogue, so that language can be a tool to avoid war, so that it can be sincere, and so that it open up the door to further dialogue. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Moda, for having reminded us of how we have to re-educate ourselves to peace. Thank you also for having reiterated how important dialogue is on all levels, because having a dialogue is the first obstacle we have to overcome if we want to exchange our points of view, if we don't want to simply strive to have our ideas prevail over others. Mozambique is always a source of inspiration, and we always have to remember that peace has to be reinvented every day. And to conclude now, let me give the floor to Jérôme Tubiana of Doctors Without Borders. You have a number of different roles within the association. Over to you. And if, with your permission, I would like to remain seated. And I could have spoken in the forum on migration, because I'd like to share with you what we as Doctors Without Borders have been seeing for years now, which is what doesn't allow us to imagine peace. And what I'm referring to is the fact that in many parts of the world, we are closing in on ourselves. It's becoming increasingly difficult for us to access conflict zones, zones which have become forgotten wars, as we were saying earlier. And I have the privilege of working on two especially violent crises, because I have been working on the conflicts in Sudan conflicts which have been going on for a long time now, which are increasing. And the second front is the crisis I refer to as the migration crisis, a serious and very violent crisis. And I focus on Libya specifically, and then the Mediterranean and Europe. These two crises have common roots. One is discrimination and racism. The discrimination and the racism that the black communities have to experience in Sudan and in Libya. The Sudanese conflict wishes to destroy certain communities which are considered to be inferior. And the crisis in Libya is an attack against Europe, which is closed in on itself. And it is an attack on universal human values. And these crises have also brought about things that United Nations have referred to as crimes against humanity. The UN and other observers also refer to international complicity, including European complicity. This accusation focuses on the many agreements signed by the European Union and some of its member states with Libya, Sudan, and other countries as a specific way to block migrants and refugees. Under panic, with any even minimum increase in the flows of migration towards Europe, and with the fear that these flows of migration could lead to the victory, to the electoral victory of the extreme right, Europe reacts in the same way that the extreme right would react with. There's always the attempt of blocking people who wish to travel as south as possible. Often these people are refugee seekers or asylum seekers who legitimately ask for asylum. And this is, in fact, a violation of international law. This is a right which has continued to be eroded by these so-called externalization policies in Europe. Now, to refrain from openly limiting the rights of the richer and whiter human beings, Europe chose, as the US did in Guantanamo 20 years ago, to operate in zones where there is no law. These are countries which cannot or do not want to apply universal rights, in which governments or armed forces and militias are on the search for financing and political recognition from Europe. And this is what Europe gives them through complex and opaque financing, which dilute European responsibility. There's only one condition, which isn't compliance with law. The only condition is to reduce the flows of migration. And to obtain concrete results, everything is allowed. And the message, therefore, that Europe is conveying is that violence against migrants, which is something which exists in all of the EU's partner countries south of the Mediterranean, is tolerated as long as the flows are reduced. And it doesn't matter whether or not in the long term this policy becomes counterproductive, because not only does it stop the rise of the extreme right, it also strengthens authoritarian governments and violent armed forces, worsening or creating political crises which then lead to new movements towards Europe, which is exactly what happened in Sudan. Beginning in 2015, Sudan, which has an Islamist regime, the leader of which is subject to an international arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court on the accusation of genocide. And Sudan was chosen by the EU as the venue for its regional process. The so-called Khartoum process is a way of countering migration from the Horn of Africa. The Sudanese forces, be they regular and non-regular forces, benefit due to European financing. And other forces, therefore, want to cooperate with Europe in the same way. And nowadays, these forces, which are legitimized by the EU, are fighting one another, causing bloodshed in their country and causing the fleeing of millions of Sudanese citizens, interlinking war with migration in the south of the Mediterranean. From the very beginning, in April 2023, the new Sudanese civil war became the main refugee crisis in the world. Since the flows from India in 1947, nowadays 10 million Sudanese are displaced and 1.5 million have left the country. In neighboring countries, the UN exploits the fear of migration of the EU to obtain more funding. as done by the chief of the UNHCR, Filippo Grandi, who threatened the EU with new flows of migrants unless it continues funding the aid distributed on the borders of Sudan. And unfortunately, we still can't fathom the fact that a refugee camp on a border isn't the final destination for people. In the Doctors Without Borders project in Sudan, or in the refugee camps in Chad, we realize that we are present in places which are both starting points and transiting points, next to populations which are then present in our projects along the migration routes in Libya, in Tunisia, and in Calais here in France. The Sudanese have become the majority of our patients. And this makes our project a privileged observatory on how a crisis which starts from the movement of population feeds what the EU feels is a migration crisis. It allows us to shed light on the paradoxes of European reactions. Now, some Western countries are now aware of this crisis, and they give Sudanese asylum seekers a status of immediate protection. The U.S. government has extended its temporary protection status for the Sudanese and Ukrainians up to 2025. In France and the UK, in which success rates for Sudanese asylum seekers has now reached 98%, immediate protection has been given to Sudanese asylum seekers according to the model implemented for Ukrainians, and 4 million of which have already benefited from immediate protection in the EU. The Sudanese from Darfur have now once again become legitimate war refugees that Europe should welcome, as they have done for the Ukrainians. However, we're seeing contradictions in national authorities for asylum, which should grant protection to the Sudanese. Europe isn't interested in extending the Ukrainian exception to other war-torn countries, and this leads to criticism for having double standards, which considers that there are good white Christian refugees from Ukraine, whereas those who come from Africa are bad. The Sudanese still have to pay traffickers to cross the Sahara and the Mediterranean to obtain protection. For all refugees south of the Sahara, we can only see how weak the processes are. That's why, together with Sant'Egidio, we're working to open humanitarian corridors and other legal and safe ways to travel, especially for those who are blocked in Libya. For years now, we have been submitting this project to the French government. And yet, despite the fact that thousands of Syrian refugees were able to benefit from the project, the doors are still shut for the refugees who are still in Libya. And even in this case, we can only be shocked by the double standards used by the EU. During a humanitarian conference on Sudan in Paris last April, President Macron stated that there is no double standard when it comes to Sudan and other conflicts which are covered by the press and by diplomacy. The Sudanese who were there simply had to realize that this was a denial of reality. It isn't a matter of priority or competition in principle, and therefore our political leaders should be able to concentrate on more than one crisis at the same time. It is now a political and ethical matter. The Sudanese crisis, which has been going on for 18 months now, has had no new awareness on past mistakes made by Europe, nor has its migration policies been reviewed, despite the moral costs they have. And unless we have a deep review of these policies, the humanitarian response will never be enough. Even with adequate funding, we could never have the possibility of meeting the needs of millions of people who are now traveling along the routes between Sudan and Europe, in a space in which we know that there is no safe country for the sub-Saharan refugees. We often ask ourselves, what can governments do? What can our governments do? And what can French citizens do to help a country which is seemingly so distant as Sudan? And the clear answer is this: we can welcome refugees and we can respect international law. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Merci de votre intervention, la dernière qui...
Thank you very much for this last contribution, which reminds us of the link between wars and migratory flows, starting from the example you mentioned, the example of Sudan. First of all, thank you. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you for willing to share your opinions, your commitments, your efforts. Thank you for allowing us to travel to different places of the world to understand what's spiritual, what's political, what unites us all. That is to say, the fact that we all belong to the human race since time flies. I will hand the floor over to you if you have any questions, and we will answer.
Une question là-bas, monsieur. Je vais prendre trois questions.
Three questions for now.